You are listening to the sweet sounds of the Paperback Warrior podcast.
Welcome back to another edition of the Paperback Warrior podcast, and this is the new and improved Paperback Warrior podcast. Man, we are surrounded by lights, cords. We've got stuff laying everywhere. I don't know what half of it does, but man, it sounds great.
If you thought we sounded smart before, wait until you hear this.
Oh, jeez.
We could actually harmonize now.
We really can. So to explain to readers our listeners how this was working last time, Tom and I were sitting thigh to thigh, using one little small microphone that was hooked to a laptop computer, and it was about the size of a little desk fan. So we had to share the microphone, so we would just pass it to each other when we wanted to say something. We could never actually talk to each other.
Now we could actually talk over each other.
Exactly, even better. Yeah, that's great.
Anyway, so I want to thank all the listeners who donated money so we could buy this awesome equipment. And it's worked out great. Thank you so much for your donations. We appreciate it. We went into a little bit of personal debt where we had to dig into our own pockets, don't tell my wife, to make up the difference so we can get this really great equipment. So we're going to leave the donate tag up. And there's also expenses associated with Paperback Warrior as far as web hosting and stuff like that. So to the extent that you enjoy this podcast and you feel like it might be worth a couple bucks, you can go to our paperbackwarrior.com page, get off the mobile version onto the main page, and click on the donate button in the upper right-hand corner if you want to throw a couple bucks at us to defray the cost of putting this out every week.
Yeah, sounds good. And I'll also point out that this is the first Paperback Warrior podcast episode that's coming from Tom's library.
Yes. We'll maybe post some photos online to show you the recording session in the library. And thank you so much for coming over here. It saved me the trouble. And it took us a while to unload your trunk with all this recording equipment.
Yeah, it's good to be here though. You know, it gives me a little bit of different look. You got a lot of different stuff than what I do. Plus, your office slash library is surrounded by all these vintage crime noir posters and screen prints and whatever that you have.
Well, I found a place, a photo shop in Miami that doesn't seem to care about intellectual property rights, and so if you upload a high resolution copy of an old paperback cover, they will blow it up into a canvas print for you. And so I decorated my library with just maybe a dozen of these things all over the walls with some of my favorite book covers. Yeah, it definitely gives us a great environment for a show about vintage crime noir. Well, and also it allows people to listen to what we're seeing. So anyway, but that's probably not what they want to hear. They probably want to hear what is on today's episode. So why don't you tell us what's on the agenda for today? Today, Tom is going to present a feature on Ed McBain, and we're going to go over his body of work. Tom also has a review for Girl with the Long Green Heart by Lawrence Block. And what are you going to review? I'm also going to follow in with the Ed McBain feature and do a review for 87th Precinct Number 1, Cop Hater by Ed McBain. Why don't we launch right into it? There's a lot to talk about with Ed McBain, and then if we have time for small talk on the back end, we could talk about some shopping trips and other stuff. Sound good? Let's do it. All right, so I want to talk about Ed McBain, specifically dwelling on his 87th Precinct series, which is immensely popular. Ed McBain was born in 1926 as Salvatore Lombino. He legally changed his name to Evan Hunter in 1952 at age 26. He's a native New Yorker from East Harlem in the Bronx. He was in the Navy during World War II on a destroyer where he passed the time writing short stories. He sold his first story in 1951, a science fiction story called Welcome Martians, published under the name of S.A. Lombino. In 1951, he became an editor at the Scott Meredith Literary Agency. And we've talked about them. Do you remember what we talked about, the Scott Meredith? I can't remember. They're basically the talent scouts who supplied all the talent from Manhunt magazine. Oh, yeah. And they represented basically all the big names in 1950s crime fiction. A group of guys who became kind of the farm team for Manhunt. And when there were issues of Manhunt where there were multiple Evan Hunter short stories published under various pseudonyms. He sold stories under the name Hunt Collins and Evan Hunter back when it was a pseudonym. and then he legally changed his name to that pseudonym in 1952. He came from the here's a fun one. Evan Hunter, the name came from his high school, Evander Childs High School, and Hunter came from his college, Hunter College.
Yes, and in fact, on the digital version of Cop Hater, if you get that off of Amazon, there's an introduction from the author, and he explains how that came up. And
that is the source of a lot of the material I'll be talking about today. Yeah. If I went that route, my name would be Bishop O'Connell Clemson.
Yeah, okay.
So anyway, he had a bunch of other pseudonyms as well, including John Abbott, Kurt Cannon, Hunt Collins, Ezra Cannon, Ted Tane, and Richard Marston. Many of the books have been reprinted under the Ed McBain name in an attempt to boost sales after things went gangbusters with the success of the 87th Precinct series. I read a Richard Marston book called Vanishing Ladies that was reprinted later under the McBain name with one of those really cool art covers. It was a very good standalone mystery. I wasn't bowled over by the final explanation as to why the ladies were vanishing, but it was still a very fun read. Anyway, he had a huge hit. His first hit book was under the Evan Hunter name. It was in 1954. It was called The Blackboard Jungle. It was about juvenile crime in the New York public school system, and it became a hit movie. And you and I were talking before we went on the air about the juvenile delinquent genre of fiction.
Yes.
In the mid-1950s, there was a film and literary movement surrounded juvenile delinquency that I think coincided with the invention of rock and roll when people were just absolutely terrified of teenagers. So let's get to the origin story for the 87th Precinct series. Let's cut to 1955. The editor-in-chief of Pocket Books had a problem. Eric, do you know what his problem was?
I don't, Tom.
Earl Stanley Gardner was their big moneymaker, right? What did he write?
Perry Mason.
Perry Mason, right. And Cool and Lamb, but Perry Mason mostly.
Yeah.
And he was their moneymaker. So Pocket Books was doing quite well with new Perry Mason books, but they were also reissuing Perry Mason books with new covers on a rotating schedule, which is why when you and I go to the used bookstore, it's just choked with Perry Mason books with a variety of different covers.
It's out of control.
Problem was, and Cool and Lamb as well, which is the series that Earl Stanley Gardner wrote under the name A.A. Fair. The problem was Gardner was getting old, and Pocket Books wanted to make sure they had a mystery writer to replace him. Now, Evan Hunter, had written some police stories influenced by the Dragnet radio show, and he had this idea for a series. He felt that when you make the police the main character, it really lent itself to murder stories because in reality, civilians and private eyes are seldom called upon to solve murders. Mystery authors always need to use some unbelievable contrivances to have non-police characters tasked with solving a homicide whodunit. And so having your hero be a cop solves that problem. You can have a murder mystery without tying yourself into knots as to why, Private Eye Peter Chambers is investigating this murder. But the idea of having a single cop as a hero did not appeal to Hunter. But then it occurred to him to have a squad room of cops, a conglomerate hero, Eric, if you will, carry the series. It had never been done before, and he pitched the idea to the editor at Pocket Books before he'd even written a single word of it. Pocket Books gives him a contract for 3 books to see how it would go. And Hunter gets to work researching and bugging the hell out of NYPD officers in his precinct to observe their procedures, do ride-alongs. He was sitting in on lineups. He was asking just a ton of questions because he was never a cop, but he wanted to make the series very realistic. And so the next challenge that he had sparked another innovation in this series. If you set a series in New York City, it's going to be riddled with geographic, policy, and procedural mistakes because the NYPD is just this labyrinth of a bureaucracy. And so what McBain did, or Hunter did, I guess, was he formed basically a mystical city that looked and smelled a lot like New York City, but was never ever called New York City. He created this entire city with bodies of water, landmarks, precincts, out of whole cloth, just out of his imagination. It was a city, again, very much like New York that had boroughs. There was a borough called Combs Point that very much resembled Brooklyn. But most of the action took place in the borough of Isola, I-S-O-L-A, which would remind readers a lot of Manhattan if they've been to Manhattan. But it was also the home to the 87th Precinct, which is where this group of cops were, which is going to be this mystery series. And so the 87th Precinct was born in that way. The next huge innovation that we'll call him Ed McBain did was create the voice of a narrator in the series. Now, this is a third-person narrated series, right? It's not like one of the cops is telling the story. But the author intrudes in the narration with great regularity, almost like a first-person narrator, offering opinions and analysis. Hunter described it as such. He said, "Somebody will suddenly start talking or thinking or commenting, and it won't be any of the cops or crooks. It'll just be this faceless, anonymous someone sticking his nose into the proceedings like an unwanted guest. That is Ed McBain." And it's kind of a neat way to write, right? Having a very chatty third-person narrator. So Hunter delivers his first 3 87th Precinct novels, Cop Hater, which you're going to review later, The Mugger, and The Pusher, all published in 1956. Now, pocketbooks must have been pleased because they kept them coming. The series continues from 1956 to 2005 for about 55 books, several short stories, and novellas. So the series ends in 2005 when Hunter dies from lung cancer. He was a smoker. Lots of peripheral content. There were 8 theatrical movies based on the novels, but only a couple in English. There was a Japanese movie, a French movie, Italian, Canadian, Ukrainian. People are probably most familiar, if you're into movies, with the 1972 movie Fuzz, starring Burt Reynolds as Detective Steve Carella. There was an 87th Precinct TV series that ran for a single season on NBC in 1961 and 1962. There were 4 movies based on the 87th Precinct books, including one starring Columbo. They basically took a Columbo, made a TV movie of it, but they used one of the novels from the 87th Precinct to make that happen. There was an 87th Precinct comic book series in 1962. There was a Swedish graphic novel created in 1990 that was an adaptation of Cop Hater. In 1975, there was a short-lived Ed McBain's 87th Precinct mystery magazine packed with short stories from many authors, including an Ed McBain story in each issue. I'm unclear how long that digest lasted. Here's a fun one, which will resonate with you. The hero of the series, the 87th Precinct, if we could choose one, was Steve Carella. He gets a mention in Stephen King's The Stand as being part of the Big Apple's 87th Precinct.
Really?
Yeah, I remember I reread The Stand 2 Christmases ago because it was one of my favorite books when I was young. I want to see if it held up. Yeah. And I remember seeing that thinking, like, oh my God. I'm sure King was a McBain fan. They probably knew each other.
I'm sure.
So the book started out as basic 180-page novels in the 1950s, and they got longer over time as the market began demanding longer books. McBain describes his formula for the novels as such, quote, "I usually start with a corpse, and then I ask myself how the corpse got to be that way. And I try to find out just like the cops would. I plot loosely, usually a chapter or 2 ahead, going back to make sure that everything fits. All the clues are in the right places. The bodies are accounted for. I believe strongly in the long arm of coincidence because I know cops well. I know how much it contributes to solving real police cases." Kind of neat. It sounds like he really thought this through.
Yeah.
My experience with the series, I'm certainly not an expert, but I've read a few, is that the books can really be read in any order. But I'd recommend starting at the beginning because I'm personally partial to these shorter books. You get to know the cops and their personalities as you read them. You know, Steve Carella's everyone's favorite. He's sort of the big hero. But there's a Jewish cop named Meyer, who's really interesting to me. Different police on the squad have varying roles. Sometimes in the series, cops get killed and they're gone from the series forever. Sometimes new cops are introduced and become part of the 87th Precinct family. Now, here's an idea. I get that diving into a 55-book series can be daunting, and so I want to tell you a fun way to read these books as a series within a series. Most of the bad guys in the 87th Precinct series come and go within one novel, but there is one recurring villain who keeps coming back for more, named the Deaf Man, D-E-A-F. He has a story arc over the course of several novels that you can read in order. So early in the series, our hero Steve Carella marries a woman named Theodora Carella, who goes by Teddy. Now, she's a deaf mute, and she's presented to this saintly woman. And sometimes Steve has to save her, which creates interesting dilemmas because of she doesn't speak and she can't hear. Anyway, McBain dreamt up a criminal mastermind known as the Deaf Man to serve as a counterbalance to Teddy's goodness. The Deaf Man is based on Professor Moriarty from the Sherlock Holmes series. and the Deaf Man plots elaborate and vexing crimes for the 87th Precinct to solve, with Steve Carella being his main nemesis. The Deaf Man, interestingly, is not actually deaf. He's just hard of hearing, wears a hearing aid. So there are 6 novels featuring the Deaf Man. And if you read those in order, you got a really nice little story arc, kind of, again, a series within a series. Let me give you those. The Deaf Man series, the Deaf Man appears in the following 87th Precinct novels. The Heckler is when he came in first. I read that one, 1960. Fuzz in 1968. That was the one that they made the movie of. Yul Brynner played the Deaf Man in the movie. 1973, Let's Hear It for the Deaf Man. 1985's 8 Black Horses. 1993's Mischief. And 2004's Hark, with the exclamation point at the end. There's also a podcast called Hark, the 87th Precinct podcast, that's doing a deep dive into the books in the series. Those guys are also always very nice to us on social media. People should check them out. And so that's pretty much my explanation for the 87th Precinct. I based it on online articles. Wikipedia was very helpful. And like you mentioned, McBain wrote an introduction to Cop Hater in recent editions that gets into a lot of detail on that. And so it's I thought that was incredible. Him looking back on his career years and years later, probably around 2000, he wrote the introduction about how he formed the series, and I found that super helpful. You're a fan of the series also, right?
Well, yes, I am, and I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that I've only read one book. I really enjoyed it a lot, but there's so many books.
There are, and like I said, it is daunting. It's a heavy lift if your thought is that you're going to read them all. And they get longer over time, and I suspect they're probably not as good, the ones written in like 1998 as the ones written in 1950-something, but it's worth checking out.
The Deaf Man stories, and I certainly don't want to offend McCain readers, but do those come across as a bit pulpy with the criminal always escaping? And
it's not like he basically plans these elaborate crimes, almost like Rube Goldberg devices, where a bomb that's going off in this bureau is going to distract the cops, so then he and his crew can like do the jewel heist there and then set up somebody. There are these ingenious crimes, and he's always trying to make a fool of Steve Carella, who he seems to have a real hard on for.
Yeah, I keep picturing the Joker for some strange reason.
It's kind of like that, but they really are his tip of the hat to the Sherlock Holmes stories, because it's so much a meeting of the minds of those two guys.
Okay.
So what, you want to do your Cop Hater review since we're on the topic? Yeah,
we'll roll right into that. So it's 87th Precinct, number 1, Cop Hater. This is obviously the first of many 87 Precinct novels that McBain would write, as Tom alluded to earlier. Cop Hater was authored in 1955, and it was released by Perma Books in 1956. Later, a more illustrious version would surface via Signet, which released dozens of these titles with really visual crime noir covers. I know I try to collect those. I think Tom has a bunch of them over here on his shelf. I prefer reading those versions of the book for some reason, and I don't know why. I guess it maybe just gives me a sense of the environment at that point in history. They just look great. But as I talked about earlier, the Amazon digital version of the novel, McBain intros with how he spent a great deal of time within the New York Police Department researching and planning the story and the characters. And he, of course, explains the pseudonym in his own words, which I thought was really interesting. And Tom, I speculate, other than Dragnet, is this really the standard for the modern day police procedural?
I would definitely say so. It's probably the most successful series of police procedural novels, and certainly the first ones. Again, there's a Dragnet radio show, and then the Dragnet TV show, which I imagine at some point it became a bit of an echo chamber, where 87th Precinct was probably being inspired by the Dragnet TV show and vice versa.
Right, yeah, dozens and dozens of copycat sort of
I would
series.
say that darn near every police procedural novel over the past 60 years is really just a tribute and a tip of the hat to the Ed McBain 87th Precinct series.
Yeah, interesting. I'm sure there's a lot of authors and books that contribute to the police procedural genre, but this series, as you mentioned, really stands out, and it's wildly popular. It's really become mainstream reading. I'd also point out, as you mentioned earlier, sometimes the central character of the series is really just the entire squad. Certainly Steve Carella is featured as a main character, but some books have more emphasis solely on other squad members, not just Carella. While the squad is important to the storylines in the series, the city itself is almost like its own character. The city's, of course, like you mentioned, modeled after New York City, but it's a completely fictional city that's never been named throughout the series' history. It's just the city.
Right. The different boroughs have names, but the city itself does not.
Yeah, we don't know what the city's called. Of course, the title of the first book is Cop Hater because the storyline is essentially that. It's a madman killing off police officers. Detective Steve Carella is the lead character in this book, and he's prowling through the alleys, the buildings, the squad rooms in search of clues, and, of course, the killer. Carella is a recurring, consistent character throughout the series, as is fiancée Theodora Franklin, who's introduced in this story. It's interesting because all through this novel, there's this thick, muggy July heat that just plays havoc on all the characters. They're sweaty, they're irritated, it's grimy, and McBain does a really good job of describing that. I thought it was a really engrossing story throughout. And the fact that the author introduces these police officers to readers before having them killed off really helped me sort of empathize with Carella and his squad. I mean, we get to know these officers, and then 10 or 15 pages later, they're killed, which it was interesting that he did that. But overall, this is a really solid story. It's a fantastic debut to the series. I don't know why I haven't read more, but I was blown away by this one. And Tom, I've got a little tidbit here for you.
Lay it on me.
All right. You're the resident crime noir king here at Paperback Warrior. You probably already knew that The Cop Hater was adapted for cinema in 1958. I think you mentioned that. But what you didn't know was that the screenplay for the film was written by well-respected crime noir author Henry Kane.
Get out of here, really?
Yeah, Henry Kane authored a popular series of books starring Private Eye Peter Chambers. And I think it's interesting that Henry Kane would go and write the screenplay for one of Ed McBain's work.
Why not ask Hunter or McBain himself?
I don't know. It's I found that really odd.
It's interesting.
And I'm hoping that that's the same Henry Kane. It's
got to be.
From all my research, it shows that he was a...
the era is right. There's no other Henry Kane doing that, yeah.
But anyway, that's my review for Cop Hater by Ed McBain.
Good. All right. Well, thanks for running that down. That's probably enough Ed McBain for one night.
Yeah, good stuff.
But let me shift over to my review. I want to talk about the Girl with the Long Green Heart by Lawrence Block. It was released as a Fawcett Gold Medal original in 1965, but most of our listeners are probably going to be more familiar with it when it was brought back by Hard Case Crime as a reprint in 2005 with a new cover by the great Robert McGinnis. Although I have to say I don't know who the original cover artist was, but that cover is real nice too. It's a con man story in the same vein as The Sting, and it's just a terrific read, like most things Lawrence Block touched on. Anyway, Johnny Hayden is the main character. He's a master of the long con with a specialty in land and stock scams. After a stretch in prison, he's working in a bowling alley, saving his pennies so he could one day break into the hotel business. Anyway, then he receives a visit from a younger, less experienced fellow grifter named Doug Rance, who comes with a proposition for a job. Rance has identified a guy named Wallace Gunderson, a rich guy who's ripe for the picking in a con scheme. But he needs Johnny's help to make it happen. So anyway, Johnny's our narrator. He's a fantastic first-person narrator. He's happy to be back in the game, honing and tweaking Rance's plan to engage in some fraud. After the initial setup and planning, it's off to upstate New York to meet the mark. A good bit of the opening action takes place in Toronto, which was really a neat city for... you don't see a whole lot of crime novels set in Toronto, but this one, it was great as far as being able to read the Toronto sections of this. I'm not going to give too much of the con away here, other than to say it involves land in Canada that may or may not be of interest to speculators and interested in uranium mining. The intended victim, this Wallace Gunderson guy, is a real jackass and a blowhard, so you don't feel sorry for him as Johnny and Rance are working their magic on him. Anyway, the girl with the long green heart herself is Evelyn, Gunderson's secretary, who has a score to settle with her boss. Evelyn's a scorned woman. She has larceny in her long green heart, and you'll be surprised to learn, this being a Fawcett Gold Medal novel, that she's really, really good looking.
Shocking.
So she needs to work closely with Johnny to make the scam happen, and you can see where that's headed. Uh-huh. If you like con man novels, and I can't get enough of con man novels, this one's going to be right up your alley. You're going to dig this one. There's a huge twist ending, which wasn't a huge surprise, and I thought the conclusion was a little anticlimactic, but overall, it's the ride, not the ending, with the Lawrence Block book, and this one was just a total pleasure to read from beginning to end. So it's another early Lawrence Block book that I can totally recommend.
Nice. Hey, so we talk about the masters of their sort of their subgenre, and I think I think Lionel White is the master of the heist.
Yeah, along with Richard Stark, right?
Richard Stark. Who's the master of the con man?
I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of these guys. I mean, Lawrence Block has written a lot of really good con man novels. Mona is another really good one that he wrote. I think that's the con man setup. There's an Ed McBain book called The Con Man, 87th Precinct. I think, or The Con Artist or Con Man. And I think I reviewed that one for the site. I don't know that there's one, but it's a storyline that I think a lot of people touched on. So
yeah.
We're running a little early, but I got a funny story to tell you.
Okay,
something I
I'm
just
ready.
stumbled upon yesterday. Okay. Those of you who read our website, in the early November, I did a review of a book called Negative of a Nude by Charles Fritsch. It was written in 1959. It was an ace double. It was reviewed, actually, I reviewed it on November 5. You can go back and check the website. Anyway, and so I looked into the author and found out this Charles Fritsch guy was an editor at Mike Shane Mystery Magazine from 1979 to 1985. So listen to this crazy chronology. So Negative of a Nude stars a private eye by the name of Mark Wonder. Okay? And so let's think of this as a 5-book series, but it's the weirdest 5-book series you ever heard. So Negative of a Nude is the first one. Ace Double, 1959. You can see my review. I liked it. The second book in the series is called Strip for Murder, which is a title that Richard Prather also did, but this is a different Strip for Murder.
Okay.
I just got a copy yesterday. But he wrote it under the pseudonym of Eric Thomas, and he changed the character's name to Christopher Sly, private eye. What's weird, though, is that Strip for Murder, he was engaged in a little self-plagiarism, is basically a rewrite of the same story of Negative of a Nude. So the next year, he rewrites Negative of a Nude, changes the main character, but keeps the central mystery the same, and calls it Strip for Murder by Eric Thomas. Buckle in, it gets weirder. Book number 3 in the series is called Psycho Sinner by Eric Thomas, I guess same author, same pseudonym, 1961, from Athena Books. The third book, he goes back to using the Mark Wonder name as the main character. So the second book with Mark Wonder in it is written under the name Eric Thomas, but the first book with Mark Wonder in it is by Charles Fritsch. It gets weirder. Book 4 in the series is 7 Deadly Sinners, starring Private Eye, back to the name, Christopher Sly, written under the pseudonym of Christopher Sly. So a third pseudonym for the character. The first Christopher Sly book was Strip for Murder by Eric Thomas. The second Christopher Sly book is written under the pseudonym of Christopher Sly, the same way that Nick Carter does, or Ellery Queen, where the author pseudonym is the same as the main character, which never made a bit of sense to me. 1961. And then he rewrites that book and with a new and releases it as Fury in Black Lace by Charles Brockden, released by Carousel Books in 1962, starring Private Eye Nicholas Gamble.
What a mess.
Total mess. I have all these books except for Fury and Black Lace. I went and ordered them all. They all arrived yesterday.
What's the logic?
I have no idea. I mean, he's clearly engaged in some version of what I would call self-plagiarism, which is a minor sin. But you see it a lot in journalism, where somebody will sell an article to the Huffington Post on universal basic income, and then they'll sell the same article basically 18 months later to a different publication, and the second publication is pissed off because they were paying for original ideas.
Yeah.
I ordered 7 Deadly Sinners is actually available now as a reprint from Wildside Press for $10. So I ordered that, and what that one says, it's a Christopher Sly mystery by Charles Fritsch. So I'm going to definitely read 7 Deadly Sinners. It's supposed to be good, and it actually looks great. And there's the idea that there's any. Anyway, the author later. James Reesner gave me some information about him. The author ended up going to work for the California DMV for most of his life thereafter. And he's a good writer, and he writes good books. But it was just a weird series, a weird decision to throw out all these pseudonyms and keep changing the character's name, and then rewriting the same book again and again and again.
Well, real quick, because you just mentioned something that made me think of this. You mentioned character names that are used as the author's name as well. Did you touch on McBain's Kurt Gannon?
No, I didn't touch on that. Well, why don't you bring that up? Because
the only thing I know is that there's a book that's written by Kurt Gannon, and it's starring...
it's Kurt Cannon.
Cannon, okay.
Yeah. Kurt Cannon he wrote 2 mysteries starring Kurt Cannon as a private eye. One, I think, is called I Am Cannon or something like that.
Yes.
One of those, the very first one, was reprinted as a hard case crime. Do you remember the title of that one?
No, I just got it too, and I can't remember it.
Was it So Rich, So Dead?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. But it
sounds right.
Yeah. And I'm told it's not that great. But I'd be interested to see. You got a copy of the original, so read it and let me know. But I'm told it's not fantastic.
Okay, good to know. All right, so that wraps up the new version of Paperback Warrior Podcast. I hope it sounded great. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. We were enjoying the new equipment, so we thank you for that. And we'll be back next week with a whole new episode. And Tom's got something really special for next week. I'm not going to ruin it, but it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, next week we're going to have some fun. It's going to be a good episode.
Yeah. But yeah, that's it. So you guys take care, and goodbye.
All right, be cool, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye-bye.